Have you been to the doctor reporting symptoms such as heart racing or palpitations or GI complaints that they've labeled IBS or anxiety? And regardless of which of those symptoms or others that you're reporting, they check you out and they say you're all normal, so it's all in your head or it's all just stress. Is stress this amorphous concept that we can't take any clinical action against to address, so you're stuck with those symptoms? Or is stress a real physiologic state that actually is behind those symptoms, and your doctor is correct saying it's all in your head, but they're not correct from the standpoint that they're saying it's all in your head and it's a cop-out and they have nothing to do for you? We're saying it's all in your head and it's legitimate due to physiology, and that physiology provides actionable things that we can do to improve your situation. That's what I want to show you today. I want to go through the brain-gut axis and the impacts of stress and how addressing that stress can improve those palpitations or that IBS or that anxiety that you're reporting. I'm Dr. John Bartemus, and I'm putting the pieces together to help you live a life at optimal. So how is stress driving your symptoms, and what can we do about it? Let's dive into that today. So first thing we need to understand is that all stress must be perceived first by the brain. So all stress is going to be perceived by the brain. And the brain center that is picking that up first is called the hypothalamus. And now the hypothalamus is the thermostat of our brain. It's sensing the stressors out there. It's sensing hormone levels. It's sensing everything. And then it's telling its henchmen, the pituitary gland, to release different hormones and factors to tell the rest of the body to take action and address what's going on. So from the standpoint of a stressor that is driving your symptomatology, we must know that the stressor is perceived by the brain, and perception by the brain is not necessarily conscious to you and I. So where we may consciously perceive a stressor like being slapped in the face or eating gluten or being in a rough relationship, we may not perceive a stressor such as fluoride in our water supply or living next to a nuclear power plant and the effects of that, or glyphosate in our groundwater, etc. But the brain isn't letting that stuff sneak by. So let's remember that stress is from all causes. And when that stress is picked up by the hypothalamus, it's going to then tell the pituitary via corticotropin releasing hormone to tell the adrenal glands to start stress chemistry. So the pituitary gland will then tell the adrenal gland via adrenocorticotropin hormone, ACTH, to release cortisol. And so that adrenal gland will release cortisol. And cortisol, many people recognize as our main stress hormone. It's our fight or flight hormone. And cortisol functions normally in the body as an anti-inflammatory. Cortisol also functions to liberate glucose from glycogen stores so that we can run from that tiger or fight that tiger or whatever that stressor is. And in the GI tract, cortisol is going to have its effect on various cells that we'll cycle back to in a moment. So cortisol release is one effect of the stress response. Another effect is that the stressor will be picked up by the hypothalamus, and that's going to trigger what's called the sympathetic nervous system, SNS. And the sympathetic nervous system releases catecholamines such as epinephrine and norepinephrine, or adrenaline and noradrenaline, depending on if you live in the US or England, okay? And those catecholamines are fast acting. So those are what, when you experience the stressor, those are going to hit the system quickly. They're going to increase your heart rate. They're going to increase your blood pressure so that you can shunt blood out to the extremities, again, to run or fight. They're going to narrow your focus so that you can find the exit or see the enemy and focus on, again, running away or fighting. And the catecholamines promote an inflammatory response. Okay? And then the other effect of stress is that we have the parasympathetic nervous system, which is the opposite of the fight or flight response. You could call it rest or digest. And the main player there is called the vagus nerve. And the vagus nerve is anti-inflammatory, okay, and is inhibitory to the sympathetic nervous system, but the sympathetic nervous system is going to be inhibitory to the vagus. So how does this all play out in GI physiology? Well, the vagus nerve is a strong anti-inflammatory stimulus to immune cells in the GI tract, specifically immune cells called macrophages. And macrophages in the liver, in the spleen, in the small intestine, their inflammatory response from a vagus standpoint, the vagus is anti-inflammatory to those cells, so it's preventing their inflammation. When you see that stressor and you release that cortisol, the cortisol is anti-inflammatory to those cells, those macrophages. But the epinephrine, norepinephrine, those catecholamines, the sympathetic nervous system response on those macrophages is pro-inflammatory. And so we have, in a normal system, in a balanced stress response, we have a gas pedal, the sympathetic nervous system promoting stress, and we have the brake pedals of cortisol and the vagus nerve. And so ultimately in a balanced system, we'll have enough inflammation to do the job, to deal with the stressor, and then it all takes care of itself and returns to balance. But say that stress becomes chronic. If we develop chronic stress, then over time, the chronic exposure to cortisol can lead to cortisol resistance. So now we lose that brake pedal in this whole cycle. And because the sympathetic nervous system inhibits the vagal function, we lose that as well. So then now the catecholamines start to win. The gas pedal wins, and we get chronic stress. And that chronic stress now affects the brain and can lead to things like excitotoxicity, which can damage neurons. It can lead to decreased neurotransmitters, which can lead to anxiety and depression, and it can lead to morphological changes like shrinkage of the hippocampus. So now you have short-term memory loss and circadian rhythm dysfunction, etc. And then you can see how that neuroinflammation then makes this a loop that gets really hard to break. Okay, so this is the physiology behind it being all in your head. And so if you have heart palpitations and your heart's checking out fine, but you have major stressors, the major stressor could be driving your heart palpitations due to sympathetic nervous system overactivation. The catecholamines raising that heart rate, raising that blood pressure, keeping you amped and running from a tiger 24/7, even though you're sitting at a desk. If you're having IBS symptoms, the chronic stress is inhibiting vagal nerve function. You're inhibiting your major anti-inflammatory driver in your GI tract. Now your GI is more inflamed, and that can lead to all kinds of symptoms. And if you have something like anxiety, again, the chronic stress drives systemic inflammation, which drives brain inflammation, and the brain inflammation leads to lack of neurotransmitter substrate. So now maybe your serotonin levels are suffering, your dopamine levels are suffering, your GABA levels are suffering. So that could lead to things like depression or anxiety or OCD, different things like that. So if it is all in your head, again, that comment is a cop-out typically in conventional medicine, but is correct. They just don't know they're correct and they don't know how to explain it or how to take action. But if it's correct, it's because of this type of physiology. There is a true basis to stress. And if we can get in and figure out where you're dysfunctional on this pathway and what other parts of your lifestyle and your life and your choices are snapping into this and that need to be addressed, we can then go in and find specific actionable targets, break that cycle, reduce those stressors, and improve your symptoms and quality of life, helping you reach a life at optimal.